I'm Oumid Rohani. I'm a founder of Oumid Rohani Architectural Design and also a full-time faculty at Zayed University.
I'm Mark Cuffin, Head of Architecture for Abu Dhabi Tourism and Culture Authority.
I'm Farid Ismail. I'm the co-founder of X Architects.
Kevin Mitchell. I'm a faculty member in the College of Architecture and Design at the American University of Sharjah. One of the issues that comes up, I think, often when dealing in the Gulf region in general and in the UAE in particular, is the issue of what is time-specific versus what is place-specific, and the fact that development has been so rapid in the past 20 years that perhaps things have been lost in the process. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about this kind of tension between what is time-specific of today and what may be considered more place-specific, let's say vernacular architecture that existed in the past that has been posed as a representation of place.
Okay, well, for me, on that one, just to start off, I think really time and place initially is in the same location, because if we look at kind of the coastal architecture of Abu Dhabi and Qasr Al Hosn, we can see references to the diving for coral stone and sea stone, an understanding of the land that comes back from the tribal origins and the way in which the land is traversed and then materials are found. So we have coral stone and sea stone that are crushed and turned into a paste and cut into blocks that can build walls that turn into domestic dwellings, which turn into palaces. Mangrove poles are used to span to create floors. Arish is woven from palm fronds to help create shading, etc. So living with the land in that time is almost one and in the same. Then as time changes, things happen to these lands, foreigners come, other technologies come in terms of construction. We find interventions such as concrete, steel and glass coming to these lands as well. And I think there's a rapid growth with a change in materials and an ability to build things bigger, higher and stronger that change those initial vernacular materials into what we see now as modern metropolises that we see around us.
I'm going back to the UAE society. You've had people living, I would say, by the sea, and you've had people who were living, I would say, within the desert. And definitely the environment had a great impact on forming the culture of the people in UAE. And as a result, you see the impact of environment within the built form as well. I mean, as you mentioned, one of them is the material, using the coral or using the mud to build the built forms. And then you have the, I would say, the other implication, like being really sensitive or somehow developing techniques that could respond to this specific place and this specific environment. How could people live in this part of the world for hundreds of years without technology? So developing techniques like wind towers or thick walls in a way to be more, I would say, environmentally friendly. And then you've had, again, in a way, the influence which comes from the Arab and Islamic culture, which is always very sensitive to the geometrical form, to abstraction of the form, shade and shadow. And that, in a way, it has always been a way to somehow identify the identity, I would say, of UAE architecture. If we go back before the time of the modernization. Of course, then you have at the 60s and 70s a rapid growth that happens. The building typologies changes. All of a sudden you have airports, you have massive housings, and the city grid changes from being more pedestrian. All of a sudden you have cars that they come in and they cut the cities and so forth. So the society had to in a way adjust itself to it. So which in beginning you have really great, I would say, references where the modernity came here, and then they learned from these principles, I would say, but they brought in the new technologies, the new building materials. I mean, the whole industry changed. I mean, before that, there were no architects. You've always had builders, and the builders, they have developed the technique of understanding the material, the need of the people, and they used to build based on somehow tradition from a generation to the next generation, and in many cases it used to be the grandfather and then the son and then the father and then the son, so it passes by. And then all of a sudden you have the architects, they're coming globally to this part of the world with different background, and then definitely different approach, I would say, to architecture, which in many cases you've had successful, I would say, interventions that they took these principles, definitely you don't want to go back and you copy these vernacular forms, but rather than you want to learn from them and bring it to more modern, I would say, architecture.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think you can see references of that as well in the urbanization of places like Abu Dhabi, and going back to the traditional houses, the Arish houses that were built very close together to create the Sika, which would channel the breeze, very climate specific, and the Saha, the courtyard, to provide these sort of communal spaces around those areas. Which you can see again today in the urbanization, particularly in Abu Dhabi, where we have the mid to high-rise buildings that are on a city block that channel that breeze into the lower buildings inside that block.
You know, the whole subject of time and place is quite an interesting social dilemma. When I have friends visiting Dubai, I actually do this social experiment. I get them onto a metro from the new part of the city, which is, you know, the new marina area and so on, and I take him by metro into the old Al Fahidi area. So as we come out of the metro station, I actually watch their faces. Every single time, it's an absolute shock. And on a couple of occasions, I've actually said, "Are we still in Dubai?" Because you get different sense of scale, smell, all the senses all of a sudden changes from one part of the city to another part of the city. So I think one of the challenges that we have now is being able not just to mimic these symbolisms of the old into the facades of the new, because that really does not do much, but bringing in the true elements which had to do with the environment. And a simple example was a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of working with Shigeru Ban, and he was designing a G+15 building on one of the projects here. And the way he tackled it, he took the low-rise residential wind tower that we have in the Al Fahidi area, and he converted it into a G+15 building by puncturing a series of openings at the lower levels, by opening up the circulation area in the middle, so it becomes a complete void, and creating that funnel system. Mm-hmm. And in the podium, he did earth ram, thick walls, and this is really how our modern architecture has to start taking a full acknowledgement of what the past is and our environment.
I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned this notion of sustainability. That's become a kind of, it's the end, right? It's not a means to something else. And the dangers that it brings in terms of, I would call it an environmental determinism, in which the environment and the concern over the environment as a physical phenomenon becomes ultimately deterministic of built form. And by privileging the environment, the physical, it leaves out all of these other layers. The project you mentioned is interesting. It brought to mind the National Commercial Bank by Gordon Bunshaft in Jeddah. And that we see so few examples of, let's say, medium to high-rise buildings that depart from an understanding of the vernacular, not in terms of, as you say, a visual application on a facade, but a deep-rooted understanding of climate, of culture, of what it means to be appropriate. And we often, I think we lose sight. It's a very slippery term, what's appropriate for the environment. And we don't have enough of a discussion about what's appropriate for the UAE at this time as a place. Going back to this question of learning from the vernacular and the notion of reconstruction, because some of the projects we've mentioned are reconstructions of a past. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the value of that, and at what point there's an interesting notion called the ship of Theseus, or Theseus paradox, and it is essentially, it provides, it's a story of a ship in which pieces are replaced over time, right? So in the repair of the ship, over time we take pieces away, and after some time we've essentially created what is a ship of new parts. And is it really the ship of Theseus, the ship that's been created? And at what point do we tip that balance into recreating a past? And because that's a struggle. what you mentioned, your work. How do you grapple with that issue?
For me, looking at Abu Dhabi, I think that there is a great balance in the city of tradition and modernity that's there. You're able to see a stratigraphy of development in the urbanization of Abu Dhabi that goes back to what was first noticed as being the original watchtower of Qasr al-Hosn in 1760, right the way through to the the architecture we can see of the skyscrapers now. So from watchtower to skyscraper. In terms of authenticity, yeah, it's a balance, because there's a desire for modernization. There's a desire sometimes to strive to better things, and sometimes there's not a recognition that actually things were great in the past, and that sometimes you can trip yourself up in trying to achieve greater things. And I think that we have to be careful of that as architects, that there is a great deal to learn from the simplicity and the intelligence of the architecture of the past that can get carried away with itself with what's available now on the product list for us to change the way that our buildings and our built environment look.
One thing which we're still, in my opinion, need to work at is this revitalization of historical buildings. A good example of it is the Union Building, which is next to the flag. That is a remarkable historical significant building, but then it has great potential to become something else than just another museum piece.
Right.
And I think we need to start examining what are the other uses that we can give. Some of the old, power station houses, there's so many buildings that can actually, from the 70s even, and some amazing architecture which can actually be revived and reused.
Well, that's part of the conservation in itself, is giving a building a new use to allow it to continue its life.
Absolutely.
The original function may no longer suit or may no longer be part of society, but to give that building something, to keep it in the memory of people, is a great way forward. But also, if it's done in a very intellectual manner and through the right sort of process of conservation management plans, to adapt or add to that building so that it's absolutely legible and readily identifiable that what has been changed is more modern, and still be able to read its original use, is a real skill in architecture.
Go back to what is a sustainable project? I mean, to do a sustainable project is to build a good architecture, I would say. Now, what is a good architecture? I think the architectures, it has to be contextual. So as an architect, when you refer to context, definitely it's not only environment. Environment is one part of it, which unfortunately in many cases when the topic of sustainability is come up, it's all these environmental codes and regulation that comes in, and that's being referred to as a really sustainability. But I would say being contextual is you have to understand the history of the place, you have to understand the culture, the society, the constructivity, and only in that case I would say you could design a building that is specific to the place. Yeah, definitely the architecture has to be specific. It has to be specific to the place. I don't think we should globalize architecture. It's not a Coca-Cola or a shopping bag that it looks the same whether you're here or anywhere else in the world. Has to learn from all these, I would say, forces. And then as an architect, the challenge is how you could creatively bring all these forces together to design an architecture that is belong to this part of the world and in a specific time. It responds to the time, to the society. I mean, definitely people live differently now than 40 years ago. I mean, people used to walk, now people have cars, people have iPads and iPhones, and communication has changed, so the culture is different. So how could architecture, I would say, it really responds to these changes of society, and it still respects the environmental, the religious, and the cultural value of the people. And I would say then that would become, I would say, the true architecture that is unique to this part of the world.
Do you think that that's being done on a larger scale today with the buildings being built in the UAE? And second, going back to Oumed's point about buildings built in the 1970s that we realize now are of extreme value. And I would preface the question by making a statement that I would say that those buildings from the 1970s were probably better examples of time and place specificity than many of the buildings we see today. And maybe you could just respond to that.
You have to understand, we are also a victim of commercialism like every other country in the world. And architecture has also fallen, victim of that. A lot of the buildings that we're seeing around us are nothing but a commercial entity. It's maximum efficiency, biggest buck for what you get. So it's also to do with a reassessment of what we would consider as commercial viability. If we look at a life of a building, not as something which is 20 years, but rather something which is 100 years, and we also look at it as something which gives a public contribution rather than just something which serves the needs of just the owner of the building, I think then the kind of outcomes will start changing. If those buildings of the past 15, 20 years weren't built, then we would not be in a situation that, look, how is this tower addressing itself to the public?
I mean, definitely modernity brought, I would say, lots of values to this part of the world. Of course, the values of the modern architecture, the structure grid and kind of a system of architecture. And then I would say in many cases, they became adaptive. I mean, using the geometry of abstraction of form, shade and shadow. But you had the modernity came here a bit late, so almost the 60s and 70s were almost, it's all the postmodernists, you've had that they were almost attacking them, that it's too boring and it's too repetitive and we need to do something about architecture. So, and that had an influence, I would say, here in the UAE. And then soon you had almost in the 80s, you had the postmodernists that they come and they almost overtake, the modernity. And this, I would say, this decorative architecture. In a way, it becomes very popular, whether you learn from the vernacular in a very figurative way, and then you try to almost clad the buildings, or in a way, somehow you bring the architecture language from other part of the world, and then you impose it. So I would say that's a time, and then because of the speed of the development, the principles were in a way lost. And then you had in 90s where in Sheikh Zayed Road, they started to allow the unlimited plot regulations. And then you had these glass boxes that in a way it becomes very popular here. And because it's easy to construct, it's not expensive, it reduces the thickness of the wall. So it's, as you mentioned, it's a very commercial. I can sell more spaces, and it's almost maintenance free. Okay, of course, it's not really, I would say, adaptive or sensitive to this part of the world. But then you had technology that people say, fine, I'll do the glass box. I will accept the heat gain. I'll have these beautiful views. I'll maximize my heat, my energy, my AC. In a way, try to resolve that problem. And that, in a way, it took in 90s till 2000. Then, as you said, then I would say there was a great initiations. I mean, like Mazda and other initiations. So you can find maybe it's a time now we have to go back and to redefine what is the contemporary architecture that is specific to the time of this place. And definitely there has been a lot of initiations. I mean, 2005 and 6, and if you sit with the client and you just discuss the word sustainability, I mean, it's what is it really, But nowadays, it's coming from them, okay? And every project that comes, it has to be sustainable, it has to be environmental sensitive. The notion has been really growing. Yeah. And you will see the impact. I mean, it's happening. Now it's happening in the bigger initiations, and you're happening in, I would say, in an individual buildings around the city. But I'm seeing it that soon that it's going to be, happen in a bigger scale, that you could see the impact of the initiations in the bigger scale of the city.
I would like to ask Oumid a question. You've been intimately involved with students over a long period of time, and students are notorious for accessing the internet for their information and seeing references from around the world. How do you address that issue in perhaps providing students with an understanding that there are other alternatives versus what they see as a reference that's popular?
It's a very interesting point that you bring up, because this is quite typical of students to go through books, go through journals, go through internet, and bring up these images that they get excited about and they want to copy and want to incorporate within their designs. But I think the thing which I always remind them, I say, look, the things that you're bringing up, these are great inspirational imagery, but these are old designs. even though it's coming in a journal, which is an issue for now, but this is a design which was conceived probably a year and a half to 2 years ago. So your job as a future designer is to come up with something which is creative, not just for now, but for 10 years, 15 years down the line. And I always tell them, I say, look, in a city, there might be 100 architects or 100 designers, but only a handful of them have the ability to have the foresight to design for something for the future, of course, with the acknowledgement and understanding of their past. And I think that is the challenge.
Your work is with a client that is much more complex in terms of dealing with issues and making convincing arguments about the value of the past into the present. Perhaps maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, and just to try and link the two together in a way, going on with that, I mean, I think one of the best phrases in architecture we've probably ever had is form follows function. And today with technology and communication, there's a great chance that form can swallow a function. It could be any shape, and we can try and shoehorn something into it. Whereas these buildings from the past learnt from the limitations of their materiality and were very much built to create or to enclose a particular function. Most of the buildings that we're looking at the moment are cultural buildings now. For instance, Qasr al-Hosn started off as a fort, of a small size to start off with, but the walls were extremely thick. And within the architecture, you can say immediately, aesthetically, it's beautiful. But when you actually look at that aesthetic, nothing is built without actually having a function. The slots look decorative on the outside, but actually they're for rifles to be at a different level, a different height. The towers have got very decorative noses on them. They're not actually decorative noses. They're so that things can be dropped down on anybody trying to attack below. The door is of a certain thickness, a certain proportion, but again, to defend people from coming in. And particularly again with Qasr al-Hosn, as it gets bigger, the architecture again remains beautiful, but now it's such an imposing building. The sheer size of it acts as a defense. You wouldn't come and attack that building because of its size. So again, that form follows function goes back into those original architectures. To now try and find an adaptive reuse for it is a challenge, because we want to retain the proportions, the geometry, the way that the spaces were originally perceived. One, because they tell us of the way in which the air passed through the building, because of the way in which the walls were so close together, it kept the interior cool, but also the technologies that were used to build it. But in the future, we want people to be able to appreciate that that's how people once lived in these lands before the glass towers, before the skyscrapers, etc., that we see come around us now. So we have to try and find functions that can fit these forms to give this building an enduring new use. And going back to the aesthetic side of it as well, the Cultural Foundation building in Abu Dhabi. It's a building which has Bauhaus origins from Walter Gropius, who set up the Architects Collaborative, who then came and won a design competition for this building to be constructed. It does everything for me, because as well as it having a very modern outlook in terms of its in situ cast concrete facade, the articulation of the spaces inside is just wonderful, the way that it picks up a theatre, an exhibition hall and a library, but it picks up on those key Pan-Arabian motifs that give it a sense of place as well. The outside, very uniform. It doesn't shout, it's quite sedate, but once you get inside, the hospitality of the materiality inside the building, the beautiful blue and yellow tiles inside the building, the way in which the craftsmanship of the wood has been carved and decorated, and the engagement of the ironmongery in the building, it really is a warm and welcoming building. But from outside, very uniform, and it doesn't shout about itself. So culturally, almost it gives a sense of place.
I mean, I would ask Oumid, I mean, do you think that you've seen change over a long period of time, and with regard to this sense of scale, the use of space, how has that changed, let's say from the time you were growing up until today?
Well, you know, I grew up in a home which actually overlooked the construction of the first shopping mall, which was the Al Ghurair Center. And neighbors' doors were always open. We would, you know, share bicycles together, and, you know, it was a complete different lifestyle. Now, everybody's home is within the setbacks set by the authorities, all gated. You'll be lucky to see a gate open nowadays, you know. But then it's not again, what I look at it is not just this region.
I mean, definitely this goes back, I would say, to the impact of the car on the cities. And that's where really how the cities in a way explode in terms of the scale. And you've got, I mean, we're talking from the small alleys than what used to be pedestrian, small scale and so very sensitive to the people. All of a sudden the car comes in. It's car plus you've got all the infrastructure that goes under the streets. Yeah, you've got different authorities that in generally speaking, there's no relation between them. And everybody demands its own space within, I would say, as part of the infrastructure. So that, I would say, it had a great impact in somehow enlarging the scale of the city. And that's why you see the city lost in many cases. I would say even the proximity of the public facilities. Now, I mean, being able to walk to a mosque, if it's 200, 300 meter, 500 meter, shaded well in this climate, you could almost walk at any time. And people do that. But if you don't have the right, I would say, community facilities in it close by, then again, people somehow try to distance themselves. So, okay, fine, I will use my car. And that's what happens. Okay, you lose the connectivity with your neighborhood, with the people around you. And that's why, in a way, the sense of scale it is getting lost because there are no people.
I think it's interesting you mentioned this term reference, because I think that brings us back to it's an umbrella for a lot of the things that we've discussed. That we talked about this notion of, you mentioned the word principles, and going back and looking at the vernacular or the past in order not to replicate it, as Oumid said, with pasting something on a facade, but looking deeply at fundamental principles. Why were the decisions made, and how did they respond in a sensitive manner? And then if we come back to this question of time specificity and place specificity, when we look at what makes a place, it's those things that are, let's say, formal and spatial, that we can look at. You use the term abstraction, that we can look at formally and spatially in an abstract manner and begin to take lessons from. And then this notion of the experiential, the fact that it's not only about what one sees, but as Oumid said, it's about what one smells in a building. And I think that type of sensitivity, and I think the challenge is, yes, it's place specific, but how do we bring that into the present? And I think it's a question that I think is gaining more ground as we've discussed today, because people have looked at what's happened in the past 20 years and said, well, maybe there are alternatives, and there was a value to what has been done in the past, and a much greater sensitivity to that. And I think the challenge that we have in the work that we do, whether that's through education, conservation, or through practice, is how do we translate those principles into something that's of the 21st century, and that, as we've mentioned before, is not a replication of the past, but a building on the past, and to do something for now, but that doesn't lose that reference back to a very, very rich past.